Today's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is Carla Fowler. Now, Carla has a very, very unique background. She practices as an executive coach, but she started her professional career as qualified as a doctor, a PhD, did her medical surgery at Stanford, and then progressed and opened her business about 13 years ago, where she really is bringing all the science that she has understood, the psychology of it, into performance and strategy. And I think she's got a really interesting message to bring to everybody, because she really does understand the whole thinking and psychology of high performance, and she's bringing that science to bear to it. So I think she's got really some interesting conversation points. We talk about high performers, we talk about what separates high performers from the rest, and also how you sustain that high performance, and also in terms of some principles that she has to share with us about, can really help all of us to perform that little bit better and kind of continue on our journey to become high performance, and how we can get there, and also how we can sustain it. So really encourage you to listen to Carla. She's very articulate. She's very thoughtful in her answers. I was certainly very taken with the responses that she gave, because I thought that she was so very clear in her thinking and able to articulate her point of view in a very, very clear manner. So I really encourage you to listen to Carla. We'd love you to subscribe. We'd love you to give us a rating on wherever you're listening to your podcast, because the more that you rate us and follow us, then we can actually reach more people, which is the whole object of the exercise. But please do that. But in the meantime, sit back and listen to the very interesting Carla Fowler. Carla, thank you so much indeed for being a guest on the Winning Teams podcast. We're thrilled to have you here.
John, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, it'll be a good one. You have a very interesting background. You're a qualified doctor. You're the holder of a PhD. You did your internship in medical surgery at Stanford. You're an angel investor in specializing in medtech and biotech. And you started your company 10 years ago, really due to your passion for performance science and focusing on executive coach. Interesting journey to become an executive coach, not quite the traditional one. So I'm just curious as kind of how you actually walked through that and how you got to where you are, if you don't mind sharing.
I am happy to share, and particularly if it helps other people listening know that the pathways we take with our careers certainly do not need to be linear.
No, that's for sure.
For them to be really satisfying and successful. And so I didn't always know that I wanted to be a coach. I think perhaps that much is clear. There are probably more direct ways to this point. But I think when I thought about my career, I was following sort of three instincts, which were building like my capabilities. So things that would build a skill set or like a way of thinking, also that had jobs attached to them. I mean, very clearly, if you go become a doctor, you will be employed for life. Yes. We need more good people doing that work. And I think I was also looking at what I enjoyed. So if I found something interesting, I was heading in that direction. The idea of like a lifelong slog had no appeal to me. Mm-hmm. And then I think the other thing I was always looking at was what was I good at? What did I have some knack for or talent for? And it's funny because now that I look back at it, Paul Graham wrote this great essay it was a high school graduation speech, but he talked about, rather than trying to know what you wanted to be when you grew up, that he said you should work on interesting, challenging problems with smart people. And of course, I read that so much later, but I read it and I thought, oh, okay. Yes, that was what I was doing. You're looking for a home. And you're looking for that home that creates your biggest impact. So I think there was a lot of that involved.
Yeah, and you talk about the intersection between strategy and productivity and psychology. Maybe could you elaborate on that? Because I just found that a really interesting grouping, and how that plays out for for leaders in business?
Yes. And it's interesting. I think looking at those things, part of my perspective on it came from a lot of the personal experience of going through some of these high-performing environments of different types, like academic science or medicine, as well as looking, at entrepreneurs who are, trying to build a company in an area of uncertainty and opportunity. And the reason I think about those three areas is because I think it's helpful when we talk about performance to really try and break it down. It's a noisy field. There's lots of different disciplines that are contributing to it. And as a result, I think when we try and improve our performance, we often get very busy. We put our heads down. We try and do a lot of different things, and we don't have a way to sort of distill it or sort it. So when I think about performance, I break it into those three areas. You could think about strategy as being the ability to identify what is most potent or impactful of the things you could pursue or do, compared to things that are good ideas and might be helpful, but really for the time or resources involved are not, do not give you the ROI that some of the other things do. And I believe in all areas of life, be it relationships, even health and fitness, and of course, like our business pursuits. I believe there is some strategy or some most important things that tend to feed into those areas. And it's worth taking some time to get some clarity about what they are. Now, that's how I think about strategy. Clearly, you can have a great strategy, but if you cannot do it effectively and efficiently, you don't go very far. And so I think when I think about the execution, or sometimes we talk about productivity, that piece of it, it definitely ties back to strategy in that you do ultimately have to accomplish those things.
You do have to deliver something at the end of the day, yes.
You have to deliver something. And if you get bogged down in really futzy systems, or you aren't able to scale through your team, because again, most big pursuits aren't a single player game. They usually involve you leading a team of people to help do that. You need to have some good ways to communicate and build some momentum. Right. So that's how that connects back to strategy. And then that third piece about mindset or psychology is that you can have a great strategy and you can be great at executing, but I have talked to a number or read about a number of entrepreneurs or leaders who are just burned out or unmotivated, where it becomes clear that how you're feeling about things, what's the lens of how you're looking at them, matters a lot to your ability to do those other things. And so I look at it as something that can build sort of a positive upward cycle or a negative downward cycle. So that's how I see them intersecting.
And when you talk about the mindset, because I'm just interested in what you're talking about there in terms of psychology and linking it to the kind of performance science. For the leaders in business and leaders, it's not just the CEOs, because they're leaders right through the organization, but people who really are, committed to and engaged with leading people. What is the mindset? We talk about mindset, but what is the really the key ingredients of the mindset that they need to have in order to be really effective at executing on the strategy that they've made, which have made very, very clear to the people that they're leading?
I think there are two really important things. And I'm remembering and I'm thinking back to leaders that I worked for or who were kind of integral in my development. One was my PhD advisor. He was a scientist, but really taught me how to think. And I think one of the first pieces, I don't know that we would call it a mindset, but I would say clarity, mental clarity. And when leaders spend time thinking about and doing the work, because it is work. It's not something you have it or you don't have it. It's usually how much work have you put in to think and develop clarity and ask yourself questions that produce that. And I think having clarity about two really important parts. One is, where are we going? Like, where is it we want to end up? What do we want to have happen? And the second piece being, what really is most critical for that? I mean, there's, of course, the beautiful roadmap that maybe you have presented to your board or your investors, but there is really, like, at the end of the day, if we have to scrap this out, what matters most? And I believe that clarity is important for leadership because that's how you actually communicate to your team. If you don't have mental clarity for yourself, it is very difficult to put into words in a way that your team can hear it and then know how they win. And I believe that people really want to win. They want to contribute. And this is true a majority of the time in teams. And so to scale yourself as a leader, you really want to help your team know why they matter, what they're contributing, what does the playing field look like, and have some alignment on that. And, like, how do we score? How do we win?
Isn't it interesting though, Carla, when you say it? I mean, what you're saying is kind of, it's eminently clear and sensible, but how often it doesn't actually, it's not clear in organizations, because as you well know from working in different organizations, very often what you get is that I'm not really clear on our priorities. I'm not clear on what matters most. I'm not really clear on our strategy. And yet it's not something that the company has not spoken about or articulated, but they don't repeat and kind of come back to it time and time again. And I think the other part, I don't know whether you'd agree with this or not, but the other part is I think that, setting our priorities is kind of a one-time event, whereas you've got to keep on coming back to it, don't you? Because it changes.
I agree wholeheartedly with those things you said. This idea of either the priorities aren't repeated, sort of that message continually spread throughout a company. But I think the other thing that can happen with that is we have sort of a lofty priority, but it hasn't been translated. And some of the work of translating it into what does that mean for me as a leader and my team, like the P&L, let's say, that I oversee. And it takes some boldness and some willingness when you're the CEO, but also if you are kind of further down in the executive chain to say, I'm going to take a stab at defining this and sort of, putting a stake in the ground and saying, I believe this is what we mean by this priority. I believe this is how we could best impact and contribute it. I'm making a bet, but I'm taking a stand for my team, and I will take responsibility for having made that decision. But I think we can't get feedback unless we make a decision. And certainly if you've chosen wrong, someone will let you know pretty quickly. Yeah, but absolutely. That's how we start to turn those sort of lofty priorities into something really tangible. So that is one of the things you just made me think of as you were talking about the repeating it, and also how do we make it tangible, and where does responsibility lie for that? And I think in general it lies both places.
Yeah. And I'm just curious, because when you're talking about that, and if you think about the all of the research that has been done about engagement, and I'm not just talking about kind of before or after COVID, even though we're not really after COVID, we're still there, but to an extent. But you know what I mean by that. And and I think a lot of blame is being put on COVID for lack of engagement. But I mean, it wasn't that great before COVID. I mean, I think 70% of people were saying that they're not engaged. And I wonder, what part does our lack of clarity play in that lack of engagement?
I think it has a huge role to play. And that's part of the reason, as I coach people, that's actually one of the first things I start with. I call it brutal focus. And the first thing we do is we spend 5 hours to sort of onboard together. And I ask questions about, what do you want to have happen? Like, let's get it from the ambiguous into something a little more concrete, like what would it look like? And then also, what's most important for that? But that's where we start, because I think it has a huge role to play in avoiding burnout, in actually orienting our teams to help them know what their goals or priorities might be as related to, our objectives. And I think that people want to feel a sense of momentum and building progress. And the best way to do that is to start with a clear idea of where you want to go. And then we start to look at what's the friction that's getting in the way of that, and how do we remove that? And if I had to break down coaching or my philosophy on coaching, I think as a coach, what you can help people with is they have to go do it. They are the athlete on the field. You're not doing it for them, but you can help increase their clarity through dialogue, through questions and reflection, but also through then saying, okay, let's figure out where the friction is coming from that's getting in the way of feeling a sense of moving forward, of building progress, and start to say, okay, how can we eliminate that? And then I find that often the natural drive of being a human being and wanting to succeed, wanting to grow and change and achieve things that matter, make an impact, that those internal drivers are very strong. So we just try and get some stuff out of the way and direct it.
And if you talking about kind of performance and high performers, what in your opinion separates the high performers from the average performers?
I think that there's a couple things. The first is, of course, we all have different ranges of talent at different types of things. There is that, of course, but I'm much more interested in the stuff that we can actually influence. So, I'm not going to be a basketball player. My vertical is really terrible. And I even tried to work on it. I got faster. I did this whole program. It was this hilarious piece of my 20s. I did this whole jumping program called Air Alert. And it didn't do a dang thing for my vertical, but I will tell you, I got a lot quicker, which was helpful for other reasons in my athletic pursuits. But so there's that piece. But I think what often separates them is how potently are you investing your time towards that clear direction? And so there's a couple things. I think one is, are you able to identify what really is going to make the most difference and really concentrate your efforts on those things? Because everyone gets the same amount of time. We have and start with different amounts of resources. If you're thinking about a company, if you do a great fundraise right off and have a bunch of support, you've got more fuel. But I believe that it's helpful to think about performance as, okay, what can I do? What am I going to invest? So you need to be potent with your time. And that definitely takes being intentional about figuring out what matters most. I believe they also are pretty directed. So they have a sense of what it is they're trying to achieve. And so they're not constantly switching directions because, of course, that creates friction or wastes energy as well. And I believe the other thing is that they have the ability to think over a long arc. So I think a lot of our biggest and best performance comes because we are compounding over time. It's not what we accomplished in 1 year, but it's what we were persistent at and accomplished over 10 years. And that's where some things start to synergize in ways that, you can't just sprint towards. And so I think that is the last thing. And it's hard for us to think that way as human beings. It's an exponential curve. And as COVID taught us, we're not good at understanding that.
Well, and I think the way you described is a great answer to that question because, and a lot of it comes down to focus, doesn't it? And, but I mean, it is really a good answer. So if that's what separates it, how do you sustain that high performance? Because that's not easy, because even if you go back to when we're talking about athletes kind of have peaks and troughs in terms of they peak for, particular competitions and then they have kind of rest. In an organization, it's fine in theory, but it doesn't kind of work terribly well in practice. So in an organization, how do you sustain that high performance?
I think that a big piece of our ability to do that has to do with our level of confidence in and our clarity about what is our process and what are our feedback mechanisms. and actually spending some time thinking about that ahead of time. Because you're right, if we're thinking on a long arc, and if we're saying that actually the beginning of that long arc, like any sort of, imagine the classic hockey stick curve, right? That there's a long period of time where the upward curve is very flat. In fact, you have to look at it close to know what's happening. And, in the book Mastery, like this is written about this idea of when we are on a mastery journey, we will hit plateaus of indefinite amounts of time before we hit that next sort of peak up. And so I think to maintain one's belief and momentum and motivation, it's important to understand the nature of the game you're playing, that those plateaus may be happening where you are investing and you are actually getting better at something, or you're creating an asset that ultimately will bear fruit. For example, a great example could be if you are building a network, and that, again, those relationships are an important piece of how your business runs or some of this, but there may be a threshold, and you know that, yeah, okay, the first 500 people isn't going to do much, but those 500 people will be a piece of meeting the next 500 and the next 1,000 after that. And it will increase with speed. So some of it is understanding the nature of like the problem you're working towards and what you should expect reasonably. A second piece is understanding with clarity, what do I do today? What is it I do today or this week? Or you could even say like this year that is critical to the overall pathway, because there has to be a little bit of saying, if I still believe in the nature of the problem, and I still believe that this is the right process for right now, it's the right step for where I'm at, then I need to put my head down and do this process and not spend a lot of time remaking the decision. So I think those things can be very helpful, that understanding what your process is and the nature of what you're up against and when you would expect to get that feedback about when it's working or if it's not working.
You talk about in your articles about the 3 principles from performance science that can help people perform better. I'm just curious as to what those 3 principles are.
Yeah, well, the first one we already spoke about was brutal focus.
Yes,
it's that clarity piece, and it's related back to strategy.
I love that brutal focus. I don't think I've heard brutal focus before, and I love that.
I call it brutal focus because most of us, I would say most people who reach a level of leadership had to be somewhat focused already. And often what it means is you need another level of focus, and it almost feels a little bit painful as you're learning to do it. Like it feels sparse and just very, very specific. So that's the first one. We've talked at length, I think, about that. The second one is really about learning to cultivate power. And I think it relates back to execution, which we talked about as one of those 3 big buckets of performance. And really, when we think about cultivating power for ourselves, some of it is that sort of understanding of ourselves and power to get ourselves to do things. And I think the second piece is knowing where are there skills or resources that we need to acquire or get to help give us the fuel we need to go where we want to go. I think the third piece of that one is really related to network and the visibility of what we're doing. So it's there's what we're actually producing, but often it requires that other people be aware of what we're producing for it to have the effect we want. So,
because you're talking about stakeholder management to an extent when you're talking about that, aren't you? And it's a critical part. It's a critical part to it. And very often when I say that to people, they think, well, are you advocating playing politics? I'm saying no, but I said you can't ignore the fact that politics exists in your organization, and you just got to manage that effectively and honestly and with integrity. But it doesn't, it's not a kind of build it and they will come, because that doesn't quite happen for anybody. For anybody who is kind of listening today, Carla, I just, because I think what you're giving great nuggets here to people. So if people are kind of listening today, say, okay, I really need to kind of get into gear to really follow what Carla is saying to me. What should they start doing today?
Great question. I think the thing, and I recognize that leaders are pressed for time, but I believe one of the most valuable things they can do, if you're going to carve out and protect some time, it is to protect some time to think. And I would say to think about and to practice thinking. So I want to make it clear this isn't a one and done. This is a process. So I'm saying carve out some time on a regular basis to think about, where are we going? What do we want to have happen? Is that still what we wanted to have happen, whatever, last week or 6 months ago? It's okay if it changes. This is an iterative process. And I would say most of performance is iterative. And so to spend time thinking about that question, because it may not be as clear the first time you do it, but if you spend time working on it, more will become clear. And it will also prompt you to listen in your day-to-day or to ask questions of whether it's key stakeholders or what the landscape is telling you. It will prime your brain to be more aware of the cues you need to inform good answers to that question. So I think that, and then if there was a second question, it is to say, what is really most important for that? Again, if we have to scrap this out, even if it's messy and we barely cross the finish line, what is going to get us there? What's the thing that got us there? And I think that's a really good question.
I think I know what you mean by practice. You've got to practice thinking, and I would agree with you. But when you say that, what does that mean for somebody? When you say practice thinking, just elaborate on what you mean by that.
Okay. Yes, great question. I would recommend get a piece of paper. It can literally be like a Post-it pad. So it doesn't have to be a fancy journal. And I think it is worth writing down the prompt and then just starting to write what comes to mind. So you don't have to get the right answer. This is not a test. You can throw it away when you're done. I don't believe it's actually necessary that this be a document you save, although you could. And some people find it's an interesting evolution and journal of their pathway as a leader. But it's not about perfection, but it's about write down all the things you might want to have happen. Write down the dream. You can even write down like that to-do list that's in your brain, if that helps like get it out of the way, so you can then say like, okay, and now that that's done, or at least written down, what do I want?
So no, I'm just curious. Did you learn that? Because I know when we were talking beforehand that you've had a successful athletics career, and did you? Is that something that you learned during the work that you were doing for that career?
I think it is not actually.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It is not. No, I would say it's come much more about since I've opened my own practice and really am the driver of it. A lot of the other systems that I was in, well, actually, I would argue my PhD was very freeform. I think that was actually the first time where I had a project. I had a very hands-off mentor, like he wanted to see results, but wasn't going to come see if I was in the lab at 8 a.m. And so that was my first sort of big foray into something where it was an uncertain pathway. My job was to learn something that no one knew and to ask what were the right questions. So it's very similar actually to entrepreneurship, the scientific method. And I think that was the first place where my mentor taught me that I needed to not just say, well, I could run this experiment, or I could add this little bit onto that paper that someone else published. And he sat me down and said, Carla, why are you doing that? Not as a rhetorical question. He literally was like, no, like, what would be the rationale? And he taught me that you don't want to be like dotting someone else's I's and crossing their T's. You need to ask the questions about what the field as a whole would value and what uniquely could you contribute, and base the experiments off of that, not just, well, usually people run this experiment after this experiment, and, oh, I could do this thing because I have the tool to do that. Like, those are not good reasons, because they're not based on what the stakeholders or the field really value. And so how do you provide that? And I think that's a wonderful question. If you wanted to add one more question to think about, it matters what you want as a leader also. It's not just about other people, but it is always worth asking the people who matter, my customers, my board, my boss, what do they value? And then to think about how that incorporates into then what's the impact you're going to make.
Great answer. Great answer. Carla, this is a great conversation. We could go on, but I'm just conscious of the time, and I did say it too, but I've already gone over the time. I said that we would talk. But before we wrap up, two questions that I do ask everybody. One, a book that's had, other than something you might have written yourself, a book that has had an impact upon you. I'm just curious of what's the book and what was the impact?
Yeah, I would say within the past year or so, a book that I found really useful, both for myself, but also for clients, was called The Formula, The Universal Laws of Success. And it's Albert Laszlo Barabasi. And he is a social scientist who studied networks. And the impact of the book is that he said, hey, in athletics where objective performance is easy to measure, the person who wins the tennis match will be successful. But in most of life and business, objective results are harder to measure and assess. And in those fields, the network's perception of your results matters a lot to your success. So in other words, if you're producing great results in a vacuum, your results may stay in the vacuum.
Yeah, so what? Yeah.
Yes. And I think this is something that many people either make the mistake of, if we produce something great, people will just come get it. Or more often within a big corporation, there's this sense of, if I am leading a great team, we're producing great stuff, that will be noticed. What I'm contributing will be noticed. And I think it's really important to think about, how do you help other stakeholders know what's the value you're producing and see you, make it visible.
That's a book I haven't come across. I'm delighted to hear that, because that one goes on the list, and it sounds like a really interesting one, and it certainly would kind of be very consistent with my own view of the world and how you manage yourself in the corporate environment. Second question is daily rituals, if you have them, and you're happy to share them, and how they help you.
Yeah, I do spend some time thinking every day, and I think of it as composting my brain. Again, the point isn't I don't have grand insights every day. I just want to make it really clear, because I think that's a poor expectation to have of why the practice is valuable. But sometimes I do have a good idea, and that is helpful. The other one, though, is I have planning rituals that I recommend to my clients that are very powerful to help me use time potently. And one is sort of weekly, which is kind of looking ahead at the next few weeks and really matching that with and protecting time for the things that are really most important, that can't be done in 5 minutes here or 10 minutes there. And then kind of a daily, I would say check-in with the real time, sort of how are things evolving? Mm-hmm. And it has two impacts for me. Number one, it means the things that are most important do find their space, because it's so easy to put them aside for the easy stuff coming into your inbox or the transactional things. But the second thing is, when you actually are intentional with your time and properly account for what needs to happen and be a little realistic about it, when you finish your day, you feel such a better sense of having accomplished things than you do if you just put your head down and work like crazy. Yeah. But you might accomplish the same amount of stuff, but the perception and the feeling of it at the end of the day is entirely different. And this is one of those crazy things about how human beings perceive our time and our accomplishments, that the level of intention matters, because it helps us feel like we have control and influence over our existence. And whether or not we actually have control, or that's a little bit of an illusion, it turns out the illusion is helpful. So
absolutely. That's fantastic. I really love that. Carla, where can people reach you? I mean, we'll put everything in the notes, but if they're listening to you right now, how can they reach out and get in touch with you?
So a great place to follow along if you're just interested in the conversations I'm having about performance science. LinkedIn is a great place. If you'd like to connect, send me a message. Just helps me track where people are coming from. And so that's a great place. If you're interested in learning more about coaching or would like to have a conversation about whether or not that would be a good fit for your situation and where you're at, my website is a good spot for that. That is at THAXA.com, THAXA. And there's lots of information about my practice there, as well as a way to message me through the site. So that would be the other place.
Great. Well, Carla, we'll have all of that. I'm sure people will get in touch with you. It's been a great pleasure to have you here. I've loved the conversation. I love the way you think. I love the way you kind of explain it, and I love the approach that you're taking. And I'm really grateful to you for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, John.